10 years ago, Claire, a woman with a gentle beauty and infinite kindness, experienced the darkest tragedy of her life. Just as she was about to become a mother, her son passed away shortly after birth at the hospital. Since then, Claire and her husband, Julian, have lived together, but an immense emptiness has settled in their home, as Claire has never been able to conceive another child. Each day, Claire continues to spread her kindness, taking care of neighborhood children, volunteering at a center for struggling mothers, and trying to fill the void left by her own child. But behind her smile, she hides deep pain and a feeling of guilt that never leaves her. Julian, though he deeply loves Claire, begins to sense that their marriage is eroding under the weight of unspoken grief. They are slowly drifting apart, each prisoner of their own sorrow. One sunny afternoon, Claire Verges once again visited the orphanage. As usual, she had carefully packed her car with toys, clothes, and books for the children. She always made sure to choose items she knew would bring smiles to their faces. Upon arrival, she was warmly welcomed. The children ran toward her, eager to discover what she had brought this time. As she distributed the gifts, Claire carefully observed the children's reactions. She loved seeing their eyes shine with happiness and hearing the laughter echoing in the courtyard. But on this day, one child in particular caught her attention. Apart from the others stood a little boy around 10 years old. His eyes sparkled with curiosity, and his brown hair fell in soft curls on his shoulders. He looked so much like Julian at that age that it unsettled Claire. Intrigued, she gently approached the child and crouched down to his level. "Hello, what's your name?" she asked with a warm smile. The little boy looked up at her, his blue eyes sparkling with a mix of curiosity and shyness. "My name is Simon," he answered in a soft, almost inaudible voice. Claire felt her heart tighten. Simon. That name echoed in her mind, bringing back both painful and sweet memories. It was the name she and Julian had chosen for their son, before fate took him from them. She took a deep breath to steady the emotion rising within her. "That's a very nice name, Simon," she said softly. "Why are you here all alone?" Simon shrugged slightly, avoiding her gaze. "I prefer being alone. The others are nice, but I feel better when I can just watch them." Claire, touched by the maturity and solitude of the child, felt irresistibly drawn to him. She spent the rest of the afternoon talking with Simon, learning that he had come to the orphanage after losing his parents in a car accident. Since then, he had struggled to connect with the other children, preferring to keep to himself. As Claire left the orphanage that day, she couldn't stop thinking about Simon. His resemblance to Julian, his name, his story, it all deeply unsettled her. She knew she had to talk to Julian, even though it might reopen wounds they had tried to leave behind. That evening, Claire brought up the subject with Julian. They were sitting in their living room, the soft crackling of the fireplace filling the silence between them. Claire told Julian about her encounter with Simon, how he reminded her of their own son, and the emotions it stirred in her. Julian listened in silence, his face hardening as Claire spoke. When she finished, he sat for a moment without saying anything, lost in thought. Then, softly, he murmured, "Do you think he could be our Simon in a way?" Claire, tears in her eyes, shook her head. "I don't know, Julian, but I feel that this child needs us, just as we may need him." A few days later, Claire and Julian decided to visit Julian's parents to talk about Simon. It was a quiet Friday afternoon, perfect for spending time with family. They went to his parents' house, Luke and Marianne, in a cozy home on the edge of town. Luke and Marianne welcomed them warmly. After exchanging greetings and catching up, Claire and Julian found a quiet moment to bring up the sensitive topic. They retired to the living room, where soft light filtered through the curtains, creating a welcoming atmosphere. Claire, taking a deep breath, began, "We met a child at the orphanage, a boy named Simon. He's about 10 years old, and he reminds me a lot of our son, Julian." Luke and Marianne exchanged surprised but attentive glances. Julian continued, trying to contain his emotion. "Simon is an orphan. He lost his parents in an accident, and he feels very alone. We've been thinking about adopting him." Marianne, her eyes full of compassion, softly asked, "And how do you feel about this?" Claire answered, tears in her eyes, "I feel a strange connection with him, as if a part of our past is being given a second chance. But I'm also scared. Scared of reopening old wounds, scared of not being enough." Luke, looking at Julian with a protective intensity, calmly said, "It's clear you've thought long and hard about this decision. Adoption is a big step, but I also see how much you both need healing and to give love." Marianne, her voice filled with gentleness, added, "If Simon reminds you of our son, maybe that's a sign that he could bring a new light into your life. But you must also be ready to offer him all the love and stability he needs." Julian's gaze became determined. "We want the best for Simon and for us. We're ready to open our hearts again." Luke and Marianne smiled softly, recognizing the depth of their son and Claire's feelings. "We support you in this endeavor," Luke said warmly. "We'll be here to accompany you on this journey." The next morning, Claire and Julian went to the orphanage with palpable excitement. That day, they were going to meet Simon to discuss the adoption process. They knew that this meeting could be crucial for the future of their family. When they arrived, the orphanage was alive with the laughter of children. Claire and Julian walked through the garden, and in the distance, they spotted Simon, shirtless, playing with other children. His face glowing with happiness, and his familiar figure only reinforced the feeling that he had been a part of their lives forever. As they approached, Claire and Julian noticed a star-shaped scar on Simon's back. Julian froze for a moment, his heart racing. The scar was almost identical to his own, as well as to many members of his family. They exchanged a look, a mixture of surprise and understanding. This could only be a sign. "Simon," Julian called in a warm voice. The boy turned around, and upon seeing Claire and Julian, a big smile lit up his face. He ran toward them, full of enthusiasm. "You're here." Claire knelt down to his level. "Yes, Simon. We're here to talk about you. How are you today?" "I'm good. I was playing with water," he replied, excitement shining in his face. Julian, taking the moment, gently asked, "Could you show us your back, Simon?" Curious, Simon turned around, revealing his scar. Julian, moved by the resemblance, explained, "This mark, it's very special. It looks just like the one I have, and like the ones many of my family members have." Simon, confused but happy to be the center of attention, said, "Really?" "Yes, and it makes me think that maybe we're meant to be together," Claire added, her heart filled with warmth. They spent the rest of the morning playing with Simon, creating unforgettable memories. Claire and Julian realized just how much Simon was not only a lively child, but also a reflection of their own family history. A few days after their emotional meeting with Simon, Claire and Julian became more and more intrigued by the striking similarities between Simon and their family. The idea of a deeper familial connection haunted them, and they began to consider the possibility of a biological relationship. Aware of the potential complications, they decided to proceed cautiously to avoid putting Simon or the orphanage staff in an uncomfortable position. To get answers without alarming anyone, Claire and Julian devised a discreet plan to obtain a hair sample from Simon. Though the task was delicate, they felt it was necessary to clarify the connection that bound them together. The night they put their plan into action, Claire and Julian were nervous but determined. They had planned to return to the orphanage under the pretext of visiting Simon, but their true goal was to discreetly collect a hair sample without raising suspicion. Upon their arrival, they greeted the orphanage staff and were led to a private play area where Simon was waiting for them. The relaxed atmosphere seemed perfect for their covert operation. They sat down with Simon for a craft activity, which distracted him. Simon was absorbed in his collage, while Claire and Julian exchanged knowing glances. Julian took advantage of a moment when Simon was focused to slip a small pair of scissors into Claire's hand, who was tasked with carrying out the delicate task. Pretending to help Simon cut out paper pieces, Claire leaned slightly to brush against his hair. Carefully, she snipped a few strands and placed them discreetly into a small envelope. Once the sample was secure, they finished their visit with Simon, promising to return soon. They thanked the orphanage staff for their hospitality and left the premises, hearts racing, aware of the potential importance of their discovery. Back at home, Claire and Julian sent the sample to a specialized laboratory for DNA testing. The following days were filled with nervous anticipation, and they avoided discussing their fears or hopes, not wanting to put any more pressure on themselves. When the results finally arrived, Claire and Julian sat down to discover them together. The envelope containing the laboratory report lay on the table. Claire, her hands trembling, opened it carefully. The report confirmed a significant genetic match. Simon was indeed their biological child. This revelation validated the intuition that Claire and Julian had had from the beginning. "This is incredible," Julian murmured, tears in his eyes. "Simon is really our son." As Julian's words echoed in the room, a wave of confusion and deep disbelief flooded Claire. How could this be possible? She reread the report several times, her eyes scanning the lines, looking for a mistake, an explanation she might have missed. But the results were clear and indisputable. Simon was their child. Claire felt her heart tighten. How could such a miracle have happened? She remembered the long nights spent wondering what had happened to her child, the years of searching and suffering. And now, against all odds, their child was here, in the very same orphanage, and they had never known. Julian, also overwhelmed by emotion, placed a comforting hand on Claire's shoulder. "We need to understand what happened," he said softly, his voice betraying a mixture of hope and fear. "How did Simon end up here? Who brought him to this orphanage and why?" Claire nodded, her mind tormented by unanswered questions. "We need to talk to the orphanage staff. They might know something, or at least direct us to the right people." She took a deep breath, trying to calm the frantic beating of her heart. "But above all, we need to be prepared for Simon to learn the truth. We don't know how he will react." Julian nodded. "He's still so young, he might be upset by this news. We need to be there for him, guide him through this discovery, and show him that he is loved, no matter what." The couple decided to return to the orphanage the next day. Their hearts were heavy with uncertainty, but a glimmer of hope now shone in their eyes. They knew this discovery would change their lives, but they were ready to do whatever it took to reunite their family. Upon arriving at the orphanage, Claire and Julian were greeted by the director, an older woman with a gentle face, though marked by the trials of life. After some polite exchanges, they broached the delicate subject. "Madam, we recently had a DNA test done," Claire began, her voice trembling slightly. "It seems Simon is our biological son. We are in shock, but we need to understand how he ended up here." The director listened attentively, her expression shifting from surprise to deep contemplation. "That is indeed surprising news," she replied softly. "Simon came here a few years ago, brought by a woman who claimed to be a relative. She left very little information, saying that Simon's parents had died in an accident." Claire felt a chill run down her spine. Did this woman leave a name, anything that could help us track her down? The director shook her head. "No, she disappeared shortly after entrusting Simon to our care. We tried to trace her, but with no success." She paused, her gaze fixed on Julian and Claire. "But if Simon is truly your son, then it's possible that this woman acted for reasons we don't understand. Maybe she was trying to protect him." Julian squeezed Claire's hand, trying to comfort her. "It's crucial that we find this woman. She holds the answers to all our questions. And above all, we need to understand why Simon was hidden from us." The director nodded. "I will provide you with all the files we have on Simon. Maybe you'll find a clue that leads you to this woman. In the meantime, I suggest you take some time to think about the best way to reveal this news to Simon." Claire and Julian thanked her before leaving the orphanage with the files in hand. They knew their quest had only just begun, but they were determined to uncover the truth for Simon, for themselves, and for the family they were about to rebuild. Back at home, Claire and Julian sat in their living room, Simon's files spread out before them. Every page they turned revealed troubling details, but one in particular caught their attention. Simon was born in the same hospital where Claire had given birth to their deceased son 10 years ago. This detail sent a chill through Claire. How could this be a coincidence? "It's the hospital where our son died," Claire murmured, her throat tight. She looked at Julian, her eyes filled with a pain that time hadn't erased. How could Simon have been born there too, at the same time? Julian furrowed his brow, his mind racing. Maybe there was a mistake that day, some confusion at the hospital. He hesitated, searching for his words. In the chaos following a difficult delivery. Maybe our son didn't die as we were told. Maybe he was switched with another baby. Claire shook her head, refusing to believe such a possibility, but doubt began to creep in. We need to find out for sure. Let's go to the hospital and ask to see the records from that day. Maybe it will give us some answers. The next day, Claire and Julian went to the hospital. The building hadn't changed in all these years, but for Claire, every corridor seemed filled with painful memories. They were greeted by a nurse who, after listening to their story, led them to the head of the archives. The head of the archives, an older woman with thick-framed glasses, listened carefully to their request. "You understand that these records are quite old," she said in a calm voice. "But I'll do my best to help you." After several minutes of searching, she returned with a dusty file. "Here are the birth records for that date." She handed them the file, her hands trembling slightly. "I'll leave you to review them, but be aware that what you might find could be hard to accept." Claire and Julian went through the documents, their hearts racing. They found the mention of Simon's birth, but what shocked them was the entry related to their own son. The file indicated that another baby was born almost at the same time, in the same delivery room. The other mother's name was illegible, but this detail sparked a terrible suspicion in their minds. Julian squeezed Claire's hand. "There must have been a mistake. If Simon is really our son, then maybe the child who died wasn't ours." Claire felt herself weaken under the weight of this revelation.
But why?
Why didn't anyone tell us? The head of the archives, who had been observing them discreetly, intervened cautiously. Sometimes, in moments of intense stress, mistakes can happen, and some are hidden to protect families or avoid lawsuits. She lowered her voice as if afraid of being overheard. "It's possible someone made a terrible decision that day." The couple left the hospital, shaken. What they had discovered raised more questions than answers. Claire wondered what had really happened that day, and above all, who was the woman who had brought Simon to the orphanage? Was she connected to this exchange? Had she tried to right a wrong that had been done 10 years ago? As they got into their car, Julian took Claire's hand in his. "We need to find this woman. She holds the key to everything." Claire nodded, determined. They knew their quest was only beginning, but they were ready to do anything to discover the truth about what had happened to their son. In the following days, Claire and Julian searched for information about the mysterious woman who had brought Simon to the orphanage. They felt lost in a maze of uncertainties, but their determination to uncover the truth pushed them forward. Thanks to the files they obtained from the orphanage, they eventually found a lead, a name, Madame Lefebvre, which seemed to be connected to Simon's arrival. They decided to visit this woman, hoping she could shed light on the circumstances surrounding Simon's birth and the strange exchange that seemed to have occurred. After getting her address, Claire and Julian found themselves in front of a small stone house, nestled in a quiet neighborhood. The well-maintained garden gave off a peaceful atmosphere, but Claire's heart raced. She turned to Julian, seeking his support, and he gave her a reassuring smile. They knocked on the door, and after a few moments, an elderly woman opened it. Her face was marked by the years, but her eyes were still sharp, filled with a wisdom and kindness that was comforting. "Madame Lefebvre?" Julian asked in a calm voice. She nodded, eyeing them with a mixture of curiosity and caution. "Yes, that's me. How can I help you?" Claire took a deep breath before speaking. "We are Claire and Julian. We recently discovered that Simon, the little boy you brought to the orphanage 10 years ago, is our biological son. We have many questions, and we were hoping you could help us understand what happened." Madame Lefebvre's face softened slightly at the mention of Simon. "Ah, Simon's such a sweet boy. Come in. I think it's time you heard the whole story." Once inside, they sat around a small wooden table, and Madame Lefebvre served them tea before beginning to speak. "Simon isn't my biological grandson, but I loved him as if he were. His parents, the Delacours, were my dearest friends. They were killed in a tragic car accident shortly after his birth. Claire and Julian listened intently, their emotions a mix of sadness and curiosity. But how did Simon end up with them? Julian asked. Madame Lefebvre lowered her gaze, her eyes heavy with painful memories. What I'm about to tell you is hard to hear. The day your son was born, there was a terrible mistake at the hospital. The child who was returned to you was not yours. The Delacours, however, received a stillborn child, but they later discovered it was a mistake. Simon was actually their son, but they kept silent to avoid breaking your heart. They had wanted a child so much and couldn't bear to lose him again. Claire felt herself falter. But why didn't they say anything? Why didn't they give us a choice? Madame Lefebvre placed a comforting hand on Claire's. It was a time when things were done differently. They thought they were protecting you, thinking it was the best thing to do. But after their passing, I began to wonder if it was a terrible mistake. That's why I took Simon to the orphanage, hoping that the truth would eventually come to light and that you would find your child. Julian squeezed Claire's hand, struggling to hold back his emotions. Thank you for telling us the truth, even though it's hard to accept. Now we need to think about Simon, about how we'll tell him everything. Madame Lefebvre nodded. He deserves to know, but he also deserves to be surrounded by love and support. I'm sorry for the pain this situation may have caused, but I firmly believe you will find the right words for him. Simon is a strong boy, and with you by his side, he will overcome this challenge. Julian, his heart heavy but determined, looked Madame Lefebvre in the eye. We will do everything we can to support Simon through this transition. But what's next? How do we make this official? Madame Lefebvre took a sip of tea before responding calmly. The next step is to coordinate with the legal authorities. You'll need to go through a legal process to recognize Simon as your son. This will involve gathering all the necessary evidence, including medical records and testimonies that support this tragic mistake. But don't worry, I'll help you with all of these steps. Claire, though overwhelmed with emotion, felt a surge of hope. And Simon? How do we tell him all of this? Madame Lefebvre sighed, understanding the enormity of the task ahead. It's essential to prepare Simon gradually. You'll need to reassure him, show him that he's still loved, no matter the truth that comes to light. Psychological support will be crucial to help him navigate this upheaval. You might start by talking to him about his biological parents, sharing their love for him and the sacrifice they made, even if it was under unfortunate circumstances. Weeks passed, filled with appointments with lawyers, psychologists, and relevant authorities. Each day brought its own challenges, but Claire and Julian kept their ultimate goal in mind, to offer Simon a loving home where he could grow up safe and surrounded by those who loved him. Finally, after many administrative steps and discussions, the big day arrived. Claire and Julian were summoned to court for the final hearing that would legally recognize Simon as their son. The atmosphere in the courtroom was solemn. Julian held Claire's hand, feeling their emotions surge as they waited for the judge's verdict. After what felt like an eternity, the judge, a middle-aged man with glasses perched on the end of his nose, spoke in a grave but compassionate tone. After reviewing the evidence and testimonies presented, I acknowledge that Simon is indeed the biological son of Claire and Julian. Therefore, I officially authorize Simon to be placed under their legal guardianship. Claire felt tears roll down her cheeks, a wave of relief and joy overwhelming her. Julian squeezed her hand tighter, sharing this moment of intense happiness. They had succeeded. Their son would finally be coming home. The next day, they went to the orphanage to bring Simon home. Simon was waiting for them, a small suitcase at his feet, a mix of excitement and uncertainty in his eyes. He didn't fully understand what had happened, but he knew he was finally going to have a family. Claire knelt in front of him, looking at him tenderly. Ready to go home, my big boy? Simon nodded, a shy smile forming on his lips. Julian ruffled his hair with a grin. We're going to take good care of you, Simon. We've prepared everything for you at home. The journey to their house was peaceful. Simon watched the landscape pass by the window, while Claire and Julian exchanged knowing glances, filled with a renewed promise of family happiness. Upon arriving at their home, Claire opened the door and turned to Simon. Welcome home, Simon. The little boy hesitated for a moment before stepping inside, observing the house that would now be his. Family photos hung on the walls, toys were scattered around the living room, and there was a room decorated just for him, with superhero drawings and adventure books. Simon stopped in front of the door to his room, then turned back to Claire and Julian. "Is this my room?" Claire nodded, her eyes misting. "Yes, Simon, this is your room." The boy entered the room, touching the walls, the toys, and stopping in front of a cozy bed. He turned to Claire and Julian, his eyes sparkling. "Thank you." At that moment, Claire and Julian knew they had made the right choice. They had retrieved their son, and even though the journey had been long and difficult, it had led them to this pure moment of happiness. Their family was finally reunited, ready to face life's challenges together, with love and support. To conclude this emotional story, we invite you to reflect on the strength of familial love and the resilience in the face of trials. Claire and Julian overcame countless obstacles to find their son, Simon, a child lost in the aftermath of a tragic mistake. Their perseverance, unconditional love, and determination to reunite their families speak to the depth of the bonds that unite people, even beyond the most difficult of circumstances. The story of Simon, Claire, and Julian reminds us that it is never too late to correct the mistakes of the past and to build a future filled with hope and love. Simon, now surrounded by his biological parents, will grow up in a home where he is loved and protected, finally learning the truth about his origins. In the end, this story is a celebration of family, truth, and the inner strength that helps overcome the hardest of trials. We hope this story has touched you and inspired you to believe in the power of love and truth.